Good day, everyone. This is Dr. Selim, and I will be giving an introductory lecture of the endocrine system. Here in the left side of the image, you will observe how there are so many hormones that play roles in the function of the human body. And also shown here would be where these hormones come from. So let's have an overview of the hormones. The hypothalamus, which is technically a part of the brain, secretes thyrotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, somatostatin, and dopamine. So you will appreciate from this point of view that the hypothalamus secretes releasing hormones. And these releasing hormones are secreted into the hypophyseal circulation that feeds the pituitary gland. So you can think of it this way, that the hypothalamus releases hormones that stimulate the secretion of hormones by the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland, on the other hand, secretes thyrotropin or thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and these two, the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, together make up your gonadotropins. It also secretes adrenocorticotropic hormone or corticotropin, melanocyte stimulating hormone, growth hormone, and prolactin. The posterior pituitary gland is also a part of the pituitary gland, but is more related to the brain than the anterior pituitary gland. You can think of the anterior pituitary gland as a separate endocrine gland, whereas you can think of the posterior pituitary gland as technically a continuation of the hypothalamus. So it is more related to neurons than it is related to a gland. The posterior pituitary gland secretes oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Now, the glands of the neck, you have the thyroid gland and the parathyroid gland. Your thyroid gland will secrete the thyroid hormones T3 and T4 or triiodothyronine and tetraiodothyronine or thyroxine. The other name of tetraiodothyronine is thyroxine. So T3 tri and T4 tetraiodothyronines are your thyroid hormones. The thyroid gland also secretes calcitonin. This is secreted by the parafollicular C cells. The parathyroid gland are four small glands that are located on the posterolateral aspect of the thyroid gland, and they secrete parathyroid hormone. The pancreas secretes insulin and glucagon, which are important for glucose metabolism. The adrenal medulla, which is the central portion of the adrenal gland, secretes norepinephrine and epinephrine. The kidney is also a gland, and it secretes renin, which converts inactive angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, which has both vasodilatory and vasoconstrictive activity. The kidney also produces activated vitamin D, or your 1,25-dihydroxycholecalciferol. Next, you have the adrenal cortex, which is the surface of the adrenal gland, and it produces cortisol, a glucocorticoid, aldosterone, which is a mineralocorticoid, and adrenal androgens. Androgens are male sex hormones. So the adrenal cortex, together with the testes, produce androgens. The adrenal androgen and the testes, testosterone, which is the main androgen. The ovaries, which are found in females, produce the hormones estradiol or estrogen and progesterone. The corpus luteum, which is a derivative of the ovarian follicle after ovulation, produces estrogen or estradiol and progesterone. So, in the ovaries, where there are follicles that contain the egg cell, if the follicle ovulates the egg cell, what will be left would be the corpus luteum, and that is an endocrine gland. Lastly, you have the placenta, which is formed from the zygote, the meeting of sperm cell and egg cell. And that in itself, aside from serving as the respiratory organ and the organ of elimination of the fetus, also serves as a gland, where human chorionic gonadotropin, estriol, progesterone, and human placenta lactogen are formed. So here, in the image in the right would be the relative locations of the different endocrine glands in the human body. You have the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin, that is important for maintaining the sleep-wake pattern of the human body. You have the hypothalamus, and connected to it would be the small pea-sized pituitary gland. You have here the thyroid gland on the neck and the parathyroid glands on the posterior aspects of the thyroid gland. You have the thymus, which is an organ for the maturation of white blood cells, and it produces the T cells or T lymphocytes of the blood. You have here the adrenal glands, and they are located on top of the kidney. That's why they are called adrenal. Here are your kidneys, and here is the pancreas, which has both an exocrine and an endocrine component. For females, you have the ovary, which is related to the fallopian tube, and in males, contained within the scrotum is the testis. So let's go into those organs superficially. You have the anterior and posterior pituitary gland, and what you can see here would be the hypothalamus, and this is still part of the brain or the central nervous system. The hypothalamus continues as the anterior pituitary gland through a stalk. Okay, so this portion of the hypothalamus is the optic chiasma, and this is connected to the optic nerve. Okay, and so light information that is detected by the retina of the eye continues as in the optic nerve and passes through the optic chiasma. And there will be neurons that relay the light information into the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus will use that to control the sleep-wake pattern of the secretion of hormones. So here in the hypothalamus, you will have hypothalamic neurosecretory cells. So they are not only neurons, but at the same time, they secrete hormones. The cell bodies or the soma of these neurons are located in the hypothalamus, and the axons and axon terminals are located here in the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, so your posterior pituitary gland, as the name implies, is located posteriorly, and it secretes these two hormones, vasopressin and oxytocin. Oxytocin functions to contract the milk globules in the breast and also to contract the smooth muscles of the uterus. And so oxytocin level increases whenever there is breastfeeding to stimulate milk letdown and also in labor to expel the fetus. Vasopressin, on the other hand, acts on the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct to reabsorb free water so that the urine becomes more concentrated and the water is returned into the blood. That is why it is also called antidiuretic hormone. Your anterior pituitary gland, again, is the adenohypophysis because it functions more as a gland and not as a neuron. Your posterior pituitary gland, on the other hand, is called your neurohypophysis because it is technically connected to the central nervous system. Your anterior pituitary gland secretes the gonadotropins, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. It also secretes adrenocorticotropic hormone or your corticotropin, which goes into the blood and finds its way to activate the adrenal cortex. The anterior pituitary gland also secretes thyrotropin stimulating hormone or TSH, and it goes into the blood and goes into the thyroid gland to stimulate the activity of the thyroid gland. Your anterior pituitary gland secretes growth hormone, which stimulates the liver to secrete insulin-like growth factor or somatomedin C, which subserves the function of growth in the human body. It causes the cells to increase in size and to stimulate protein synthesis. Your prolactin is secreted by the anterior pituitary gland and goes into the blood and stimulates the development of milk ductules and alveolar cells, which produce the lipid and protein component of milk. So it is prolactation. Now let's look at the individual hormones. Oxytocin is secreted by the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. So you can think of the hypothalamus in this way, such that at the lateral aspects of the hypothalamus and on the medial aspect of the hypothalamus, there is literally a space where CSF or cerebrospinal fluid is present. So it is a hollow portion in the brain. The portion of the hypothalamus that is in contact with those CSF containing compartments is called your paraventricular nucleus. So the neurons of the paraventricular nucleus synthesize oxytocin. And after synthesizing the oxytocin in the soma, the oxytocin travels along the axon where it is secreted and stored here in the posterior pituitary gland. What are the actions of oxytocin? It causes milk ejection by contraction of myoepithelial cells. And it also causes uterine contraction where it assists in the continuation of labor to expel the term fetus. So there is such a thing as your nipple, pituitary gland, uterine reflex. So what happens there? Whenever the nipple is being stimulated by the suckling infant, the afferent nerves go into the posterior pituitary gland and it causes the posterior pituitary gland to secrete oxytocin, which travels into the blood and goes into the uterus to contract the uterus. So that after giving birth, once the infant already sucks on the breast of the mother, it will cause contraction of the uterus and prevent the mother from bleeding out. Okay, because the uterus is already um, contracting and constricting the blood vessels that are bleeding. So breastfeeding after delivery is beneficial to the mother because it prevents bleeding of the mother. Oxytocin also causes cervical dilation so that the opening into the vaginal canal increases and so labor progresses. Oxytocin is also released during orgasm and it is also released during perception of the infant. Once the mother sees the infant, it will automatically secrete, the mother will automatically secrete oxytocin and preempt breastfeeding. Next, let's go into the discussion of antidiuretic hormone, which is also secreted by the neurons of the organum vasculosum. Okay? Antidiuretic hormone is synthesized in the cell bodies here and they travel along the axon where they are stored in the posterior pituitary gland. The stimulus for the secretion of vasopressin is high plasma osmolarity. If you will remember, plasma osmolarity is directly related to the amount of sodium and in the blood. And the amount of sodium increases in the blood when water of the plasma decreases. So what does that mean? Vasopressin is secreted whenever the water component of the plasma goes down. And if you will remember, what is the action of vasopressin? It is to reabsorb the water that is in the collecting tubules. So if the stimulus is decrease in plasma water, the effect of vasopressin is to increase plasma water. So that is a negative feedback mechanism. So what will be the stimuli for the release of vasopressin? A decrease in blood pressure, a decrease in blood volume, and an increase in plasma osmolarity. Antidiuretic hormone acts on two receptors. Number one would be your vasopressin 1 receptor, and it causes constriction of the arteries or arterioles. That is why it is called vasopressin, because it increases blood pressure by constriction of the arterioles. Antidiuretic hormone also acts on vasopressin 2 receptors, which causes an increase in aquaporin 2 insertion in the collecting ducts so that water is reabsorbed from the tubule and returned into the blood. So this picture from your book shows the different anterior pituitary gland hormones. So the stimulus for the release of these hormones would be the releasing hormones released by the hypothalamus. So initially, the hypothalamus will secrete into the portal circulation the releasing hormones, and they will travel into the anterior pituitary gland to stimulate particular cells of the anterior pituitary gland to secrete the different stimulating hormones. So again, think of it this way. The hypothalamus secretes the releasing hormones and the pituitary secretes the stimulating hormones. So because the different stimulating hormones affect the different endocrine glands in the human body, the anterior pituitary gland is thought of as the master endocrine gland. So growth hormone acts on the bones and the muscles. In the bones, it will stimulate longitudinal growth so that the height of the bone increases and the height of the individual increases. In the muscles, it will stimulate protein synthesis so that muscle bulk and force increases. In the mammary glands, the prolactin secreted by the anterior pituitary gland stimulates the development of breast ductules and glandular system so that milk production becomes more efficient. During pregnancy, especially in the third trimester of pregnancy, month 7, 8, and 9 of pregnancy, prolactin secretion increases so that the development of the breast accelerates. So that whenever the infant is born, the breast is already capable of secreting a lot of milk. Next, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary gland go into the blood where it activates the cells of the testes or the ovary. Follicle-stimulating hormone causes the development of egg cells and sperm cells, whereas luteinizing hormone causes the development of support cells which secrete the sex hormones, progesterone and estrogen for the female, and testosterone for the male. Thyrotropin goes into the thyroid gland and stimulates the activity of the thyroid follicular cells in synthesizing thyroid hormone, which are T3 and T4, triiodothyronine and tetraiodothyronine. Your ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone or corticotropin, is secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, goes into the blood, and affects the adrenal cortex or the surface of the adrenal gland, where it stimulates the release of glucocorticoids and um, in a little bit or in a minute magnitude the release of mineralocorticoids. Again, because the stimulus for the secretion of the mineralocorticoid aldosterone is primarily angiotensin 2 and serum potassium. So let's go into the different hormones. Growth hormone. What is the effect of growth hormone? It is a catabolic hormone because it causes lipolysis or the breakdown of fat. But at the same time, it is an anabolic hormone because it causes the synthesis of proteins. It is released in a pulsatile fashion every 2 hours. And there is a peak in the level of growth hormone in the blood. So the nocturnal peak occurs at deep sleep, 1 hour after deep sleep. So this just goes to show that whenever you are asleep, the maintaining and growth promoting functions of growth hormone increases 1 hour after deep sleep. So growth hormone is not the only hormone that affects or produces whole body growth. Whole body growth is produced by the concerted actions or by the synergistic effect of these hormones: growth hormone, thyroid hormone, the androgens, estrogens, glucocorticoids, and insulin. Inactive anterior pituitary gland or hypopituitarism will thus decrease growth hormone release and even thyroid hormone release, androgen release, estrogen release, and glucocorticoid release, so that there is stunted growth or dwarfism. What are the direct actions of growth hormone? It increases plasma glucose, and so it is a diabetogenic hormone. It increases protein deposition and lean body mass. It increases lipolysis or the breakdown of fat. And it also increases insulin-like growth factor 1, which is also known as somatomedin C, and it produces anti-aging effects. What are the indirect actions of growth hormone? It causes bone growth, it causes protein synthesis in the muscles and other organs of the body, and it also causes an increase in organ size. So sorry for the uh, messed up format. These are just bullets. So here we have the factors that regulate growth hormone release. What conditions will stimulate the release of growth hormone? Starvation, when you don't have something to eat, because growth hormone again stimulates lipolysis, which will be the alternative source of energy. Hypoglycemia also stimulates growth hormone release. Again, because the effect of growth hormone is to stimulate glucose production. It is a gluconeogenic hormone, and it is a diabetogenic hormone. Low fatty acid levels will also stimulate growth hormone release. Exercise, excitement, trauma, or physical injury will stimulate growth hormone release, because during physical injury, there is a rapid breakdown of the body's energy stores, more particularly protein. And so the growth hormone is there to stave off or to slow down protein breakdown. Testosterone also stimulates growth hormone release. Estrogen, growth hormone releasing hormone, and deep sleep. What factors decrease growth hormone secretion? Hyperglycemia, so technically the opposite, right? High fatty acid levels, obesity, somatostatin, exogenous growth hormone, and aging. So the rest here, especially the latter ones, are part of negative feedback functions. Next, let's go into the discussion of thyrotropin hormones, or hormones that are stimulated by thyrotropin. Okay, so thyrotropin comes from the word or root words thyro or thyroid gland, and tropin or growth. So in essence, your thyrotropin or thyroid stimulating hormone causes an increase in the number of cells, in the size of the cells, and the activity of the cells of the thyroid gland. That's why it is called thyrotropin. So what are these hormones? Thyroxine or T4, triiodothyronine or T3. So the number here, 3 and 4, for triiodothyronine and tetraiodothyronine respectively, refer to the number of iodine atoms in the thyroid hormone. So you can appreciate from this knowledge that for the synthesis of thyroid hormones, you need the element iodine. And so T4 has 4 iodine atoms and T3 has 3 iodine atoms. Of the two, the most potent is T3, but the most numerous is T4. So in the blood, you have more T4. But if you compare the activity of the thyroid hormones, T3 exerts more activity. So what are the effects of thyroid hormones? Number one, it increases oxygen consumption and basal metabolic rate. So it increases the rate of metabolism. How does it increase the rate of metabolism? It causes an increase in the number of mitochondria, which are the organelles that subserve the function of ATP production. It also increases the activity of your sodium-potassium adenosine triphosphatase pump, which causes transfer of 3 sodium atoms outside the cell and transfer of 2 sodium atoms inside the cell. But because that transfer goes against the concentration gradient, you need to expend energy in the form of adenosine triphosphate. Your thyroid hormone also stimulates whole macromolecule metabolism for both carbohydrate, fat, and protein. For carbohydrates, it increases glucose uptake into the cell. It causes gluconeogenesis, or the formation of new sugar molecules, and glycogenolysis, which is the breakdown of the storage form of sugar, such as glycogen. And so when you break glycogen, you release the individual glucose units into the blood. For lipids, your thyroid hormone will decrease the levels of cholesterol in the blood, phospholipids in the blood, and triglycerides in the blood, but at the same time, they will increase fatty acids. So think of it this way. Your thyroid hormone will decrease the levels of bigger lipids, but increase the levels of the component lipid, which is your fatty acid. Your thyroid hormone will also stimulate protein synthesis, which is needed for growth. Your thyroid hormone works together with growth hormone and insulin-like growth factor 1 to stimulate bone formation and bone maturation. So here, in this picture is shown the location of the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is in apposition or near to the trachea, and it is inferior to the larynx, and it is surrounded by the big vessels of the neck, okay? In particular, the common carotid artery. Okay, so if you will take a section of the thyroid gland, you will see this under the microscope. So the thyroid cells here would be this one. And you have here a pink material or a colloid material in the middle. So this is your colloid, which contains thyroglobulin. Thyroglobulin is a protein that is very rich in tyrosine, an amino acid. And that tyrosine will be the one utilized by the follicular cells to synthesize the thyroid hormone. So whenever your follicular cells will attempt to synthesize new thyroid hormone, it will take up or eat up the colloid here in the middle. So it will take or eat the colloid and utilize the tyrosine that is in the colloid to form thyroid hormone. So here is how thyroid hormone is synthesized. Okay, let's orient ourselves first. This would be the side of the thyroid follicular cell that is near the blood vessel. And this side of the thyroid follicular cell would be the side near the colloid or thyroglobulin. So, a while ago, I introduced you into the concept that your iodine, the element iodine, is needed to make thyroid hormone. So, how does that happen? First, iodine is transported together with sodium from the blood side towards the interior of the cell. So this is how iodine enters the thyroid cell. First, it is present, the iodine is present in the blood, then it enters the thyroid cell, and this iodine will not stay inside the thyroid cell, but it will be pumped out into the colloid side. Okay, so from inside the cell, it will be pumped out into the colloid side here. And that pumping will be done by the protein called pendrin. Okay, so take note of the charge of iodine. This is an ion of iodine, iodide. So iodide will be pumped into the colloid side, but this iodide will be oxidized into elemental iodine. So the charge of iodine from -1 inside, once it is pumped into the thyroglobulin, it will be converted to elemental iodine or I0. So that reaction is an oxidation reaction. The iodine loses an electron. That reaction is catalyzed by the enzyme thyroid peroxidase. Okay? And by performing that reaction, a molecule of hydrogen peroxide will be formed. But because the electron has been lost by the iodine atom, it now becomes highly reactive. So your elemental iodine is highly reactive. This highly reactive form of elemental iodine will be taken up um, by the tyrosine atoms that are present in thyroglobulin. So this process of incorporating the elemental iodine into the thyroglobulin, which is made up of a lot of amino acids and a lot of carbon atoms, is called together organification. Organification. You are making the inorganic iodine and incorporating it into an amino acid, which is an organic molecule. That is why it is called organification. So it is a two-part process of iodination and coupling. So after this, you will have thyroglobulin, which has a lot of iodine containing tyrosine. Okay, so um, these iodine containing tyrosine molecules, if individual or separate from each other, we call it monoiodotyrosine, which contains only one iodine atom. If it contains two iodine atoms, you call it diiodotyrosine. And so, if you combine multiple mono or diiodotyrosines, you will be able to form combinations um, of these that are either T3, which means you have three iodine atoms. So T3 thus is formed from the combination of monoiodotyrosine, 1 iodine, and diiodotyrosine, 2 iodine atoms. So 1 plus 2 equals 3. So that will form your T3. But if you combine two diiodotyrosines together, you will have 4 iodine atoms in total. And that is your T4 or thyroxine. This thyroglobulin is a very long amino acid, um, very long protein. So it will be taken up by the cell as a colloid droplet. And this colloid droplet, because it is a very large protein, will be broken down by thyroid proteases to form the mature thyroid hormone, which is T3 or T4, which is then secreted into the blood side. And this T3 or T4 will then be utilized by the different cells of the body. All of these processes, you have a lot, is stimulated by thyroid stimulating hormone or thyrotropin, which is secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. Now let's go into the hormones that are stimulated by the hormone released by the anterior pituitary gland called adrenocorticotropic hormone or corticotropin. So again, as I have emphasized a while ago, the major hormone that relies on ACTH for its synthesis would be the glucocorticoids. So an example of a glucocorticoid is cortisol. However, a minor role of adrenocorticotropic hormone will be there for mineralocorticoids. Again, because the major stimulus for the release of the mineralocorticoids are potassium and angiotensin 2. So here, you will appreciate in the name of the hormone that the major function of the hormone would be to regulate the levels of glucose, and it is released from the adrenal cortex. Here, you will understand that the major role of the hormone would be to regulate the levels of the minerals in the body, in particular sodium and potassium, and it is released from the cortex of the adrenal gland. That is why it is called a mineralocorticoid and a glucocorticoid. So, an example of the major mineralocorticoid is aldosterone, and the major glucocorticoid in the body is cortisol. Here would be the microscopic structure of the adrenal gland. And this is the location of the adrenal gland in the abdomen relative to the organs of the urinary tract. The triangular and crescentic glands on top of the kidneys are the adrenal glands. Okay? And the adrenal glands have two portions, a middle portion, which is the adrenal medulla, whose hormones secreted are epinephrine and norepinephrine. And then you have on the surface of the gland the adrenal cortex, which synthesizes the mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and adrenal androgens. So if we take a closer look at the adrenal cortex, this is how it will look. You have the capsule of the adrenal gland, and then the first group of cells that you will encounter would be the cells of the zona glomerulosa. It is called the zona glomerulosa because it looks like the glomerulus of the kidney. And the hormones produced by this region of the adrenal gland would be the mineralocorticoid aldosterone. As you go deeper into the adrenal cortex, you will encounter the cells of the zona fasciculata. So it is called zona fasciculata because the cells here form fascicles. Okay, these are the fascicles. And the hormone produced by the cells here are your glucocorticoid, in particular cortisol. And the last region of the adrenal cortex would be the zona reticularis. So it is called reticularis because it is net-like in appearance. It looks like a net structure. And the hormones produced here are in particular the adrenal androgens or the immature androgens. Now let's go into the hormones that are produced by the adrenal gland. And the first one is aldosterone. What is the effect of aldosterone? It causes an increase in sodium reabsorption in the kidneys, sweat glands, and salivary glands, as well as the colon. So, in effect, what happens? The sodium that is in the urine, which should join the urine, after the action of aldosterone in the collecting tubule, causes the sodium to go back into the blood. So, at the end of the day, you are preserving the sodium and retaining it into the blood. So it causes an increase in the level of sodium in the blood. So what is the best description of aldosterone activity in the colon? Absorption of sodium in the colon is under hormonal control by aldosterone. So not only in the kidneys, but the sodium and the water that is in the poop by the action of aldosterone is reabsorbed and returned into the blood so that sodium and water is retained by the human body. Another effect of aldosterone would be to increase potassium secretion in the kidneys and the colon. So this is the opposite effect of aldosterone relative to sodium. If aldosterone causes reabsorption of sodium, aldosterone, on the other hand, causes secretion of potassium, so that by the action of aldosterone, the body loses its potassium. Next, aldosterone causes an increase in proton or acid secretion in the kidneys. But because the stimulus for the release of aldosterone is a high level of potassium, that high level of potassium, by causing a release of aldosterone, causes a decrease in the level of proton in the blood. So here in the picture would be the major mechanisms controlling the secretion of aldosterone by the adrenal cortex. So let's start here at the kidney, where aldosterone exerts its effect. Aldosterone causes an increase in the absorption of sodium and water, but on the other hand, causes the release of potassium. So the effect of this would be an increase in blood volume and blood pressure. All of the regulatory signals act on the zona glomerulosa. So what would be these regulatory signals? Number one, a direct stimulating effect of low sodium levels in the blood or high levels of potassium in the blood that will directly cause the zona glomerulosa to release aldosterone. The next stimulus is decreased blood volume or blood pressure, which is detected by the kidney. The kidney, in response to low blood volume, will release renin, and this renin will cause the production of angiotensin 2. Again, how is that? Angiotensinogen is converted to angiotensin 1 by the action of renin, and angiotensin 1 is converted to angiotensin 2 by the action of angiotensin converting enzyme. And angiotensin 2, which is the terminal hormone, stimulates the zona glomerulosa in its release of aldosterone. Next, stress by the action of adrenocorticotropic hormone causes the release of aldosterone, but this is a minor stimulatory pathway. Next, an inhibitory effect on the release of aldosterone, which means it decreases the release of aldosterone, would be the hormone produced by the ventricles of the heart, atrial natriuretic peptide. So if you have high blood volume, you will have high levels of atrial natriuretic peptide or brain-derived natriuretic peptide that will decrease the release of aldosterone. Next, let's go into the deeper hormone produced by the cells of the zona fasciculata, and that is cortisol. Remember that cortisol is a glucocorticoid, which means it has particular role in the metabolism of glucose. Cortisol is again the primary glucocorticoid, and you might have known this for a long time already. It is the stress hormone. So when the body experiences psychological and physiologic stress or physical stress, it will release cortisol. But also, you have to take note that cortisol is released in a pulsatile fashion relative to the sleep-wake cycle. So it oscillates with the circadian rhythm. The levels of cortisol in the human body are highest just before waking up, and that is approximately at 8 a.m. And it is the lowest just before sleeping, approximately at midnight. It rises sharply during sleep, and the highest levels would be uh, soon after awakening or just before waking up, and it sinks down to a low level 12 hours later. So what would be the effects of cortisol on carbohydrate metabolism? It stimulates gluconeogenesis, which is the making of new glucose units from amino acids. And because the source of the new glucose molecules would be amino acids, it also stimulates protein catabolism in the muscle where amino acids are stored as protein. The effect of cortisol on insulin resistance would be as follows. It decreases glucose utilization and insulin sensitivity of adipose tissue. So in essence, it opposes the activity of insulin by preventing insulin activity on its receptor. Next, cortisol decreases the cellular proteins except in the liver. In the liver, cortisol will stimulate the production of your pentraxins or your acute phase reactants, the proteins that are released in response to an infection. It also increases the levels of amino acids in the blood. In the fat cells, it causes an increase in the breakdown of lipids. It increases lipolysis. There are a lot of effects of cortisol on inflammation, but just think of it in general as an immunosuppressive effect. So think of it this way: cortisol causes immunosuppression. That is why in diseases that have an autoimmune nature or a hyperimmune nature, where the immune system is dysregulated, we give patients corticosteroids to dampen the inflammatory response. So how does it do that? It induces the synthesis of lipocortin, which inhibits phospholipase A2 and therefore inhibits prostaglandin synthesis. It stabilizes the lysosome so that phospholipids are not released to stimulate prostaglandin production. It slows down the movement of white blood cells. It suppresses the activity of your T lymphocytes, and therefore the substances or cytokines or interleukins that are produced by the T lymphocytes also go down, such as interleukin 1 and interleukin 2. It facilitates the resolution of inflammation. It blocks the inflammatory response to allergies and therefore decreases the levels or activity of eosinophils. Okay. Aside from that, your glucocorticoids have a promotive effect on the sympathetic nervous system. So think of it this way: the sympathetic nervous system is able to exert its effect because of the permissive and promoting effects of cortisol. So if there is inadequate levels of cortisol, the sympathetic nervous system will not be able to exert its effect. Okay? Cortisol also inhibits bone formation, and therefore, if you have high levels of cortisol for a very long time, you will be predisposed to the development of osteoporosis. Cortisol also increases glomerular filtration rate, or the production of urine. So this is how um, the hypothalamus, the adrenal medulla, and the adrenal cortex responds to stress. So acutely, your hypothalamus, which detects the stress, sends nerve impulses to the sympathetic nervous system, which are found in the nerves that emanate from the thorax and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. And these release acetylcholine into the adrenal medulla, which responds by secreting epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. The effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine in the blood would be to increase the heart rate, to increase the blood pressure, to increase the levels of glucose in the blood by destroying glycogen, to dilate the bronchioles so that airflow into the alveoli increases, and changes in blood flow patterns so that blood is shunted away from the splanchnic circulation, the digestive tract, and the kidneys, and into the muscles and brain. It also increases the metabolic rate. In response to stress, the anterior pituitary gland, so this is a chronic regulation of the release of cortisol. In response to stress, the hypothalamus releases um, corticotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates the anterior pituitary gland into releasing corticotropin. So the corticotropin acts on the surface of the adrenal gland to stimulate prolonged release of glucocorticoids, which causes protein and fat breakdown and converts them into glucose, increased blood sugar levels, and suppression of the immune system. The adrenal cortex also releases mineralocorticoids, in particular aldosterone, which causes sodium and water retention by the kidneys and increased blood volume and blood pressure. Let's now go into the endocrine pancreas. So the pancreas has two functions: an exocrine function, which causes the release of digestive enzymes into the small intestines for food digestion, and it also has an endocrine function, which, in response to the presence of food, releases hormones into the blood to preempt the cells of the body towards food metabolism. The islets of Langerhans are the tissues that subserve the endocrine function of the pancreas. They contain many cell types which release particular hormones. The beta cell secretes insulin, which decreases blood sugar, and the alpha cells secrete glucagon, which increases the blood sugar. So if you will take a closer look at the pancreas, you will see uh, these structures. So the blue structures, the dark blue structures, are your pancreatic acinar cells, which perform the synthesis of digestive enzymes. The whitish structures here are your pancreatic islets, which contain the beta and the alpha cells, which are which secrete into the blood insulin and glucagon respectively. So a closer view of that would be this one. These are your exocrine cells of the acinus of the pancreas, which secrete digestive enzymes. And this would be the alpha cells. And this would be the beta cells, the blue one. The beta cells are more numerous in the islets of Langerhans, and your alpha cells are less numerous. The beta cells secrete insulin into the capillary, and therefore into the blood, where the insulin circulates throughout the body, and the alpha cells secrete glucagon into the capillaries, which go again into the blood and circulates throughout the body to perform its effect to increase blood sugar. So this table would summarize the effects of insulin secreted by the beta cell and glucagon secreted by the alpha cell. What would stimulate the release of insulin? High blood glucose, high blood amino acid, and high blood fatty acids, and also glucagon itself. What would be the effect of insulin? It causes the peripheral cells, in particular the muscle cells and the fat cells, to take up the glucose from the blood and deliver it into the inside of the cell, where it will be utilized for energy production. Insulin decreases glycogenolysis. Glycogenolysis is the breakdown of glycogen into individual glucose units. So when there is insulin release, that is in response to carbohydrate intake, it will also reciprocally inhibit the breakdown of glycogen because insulin stimulates the synthesis of glycogen. Insulin is the major anabolic hormone, and it increases protein synthesis as well as fat synthesis or lipogenesis. Glucagon is released whenever there is low blood glucose and high amino acid levels in the blood. What would be the effect of glucagon? It increases the breakdown of glycogen and the formation of new glucose units or gluconeogenesis. It also stimulates lipolysis and ketone body formation. So you will appreciate that the effects of insulin and glucagon are opposite to each other. If insulin decreases the breakdown of glycogen, glucagon increases the breakdown of glycogen. If insulin decreases the formation of new glucose units, glucagon increases the formation of new glucose units. If insulin stimulates fat synthesis, glucagon stimulates fat breakdown. Insulin is the major anabolic hormone. Insulin is secreted by the pancreas to coordinate a shift in metabolism. It causes the cells to prioritize glucose as a source of energy, and it facilitates anabolic reactions. Anabolic reactions are reactions that utilize smaller molecules, combine them to form bigger molecules. So that is an anabolic reaction. Insulin facilitates anabolic reactions. The formation of triglycerides from individual fatty acids, the formation of protein from amino acids, and the formation of glycogen from glucose molecules. Insulin, aside from facilitating anabolism, it inhibits catabolism. So it prevents the breakdown of larger molecules into smaller molecules. It prevents lipolysis. That is why in patients who are taking insulin, and if the insulin response is good, these patients would tend to become fatter because insulin prevents the breakdown of fat. It lowers blood glucose levels by causing glucose absorption into muscle and fat. So this diagram shows you how insulin works. Insulin binds into the insulin receptor. The insulin receptor is made up of an alpha portion and a beta portion. The alpha portion is outside the cell, while the beta portion is both outside and inside the cell. It is an integral protein found in the cell membrane. Once insulin binds to the alpha portion, it causes activity in the beta portion because they are connected. What is this activity? A tyrosine kinase, which is an enzyme that causes attachment of phosphate groups, is activated once insulin binds to its receptor. So, it causes attachment of phosphate groups to a lot of proteins that perform the particular functions listed here: growth and gene expression, glycogen synthesis, fat synthesis, protein synthesis, and glucose transport. So remember, insulin causes or turns on the activity of these enzymes here. The enzymes that perform growth, glycogen synthesis, fat synthesis, protein synthesis, and glucose transport. In particular, these are your glucose transporters, the yellow ovoid structures. In the presence of insulin, the glucose transporter is inserted into the cell membrane. And because they are already in the cell membrane, glucose can then enter the cell. Because glucose enters the cell, the glucose in the blood goes down. So that is how insulin causes a decrease in the levels of blood glucose. because it causes glucose to enter the cells. In the fasting state, glucose flux from the intestine decreases. So the amount of glucose that is being absorbed by the small intestine decreases. Blood glucose, however, does not go down even if the levels of glucose being absorbed goes down, because the stored glucose in the liver in the form of glycogen is being released, and new glucose molecules are being formed from amino acids, lactate, and pyruvate. And these again are stimulated processes whenever the level of insulin goes down. Those processes are also stimulated by glucagon, epinephrine, growth hormone, and cortisol in tandem with a decrease in insulin levels. Now let's go into the gonads, or the endocrine glands that subserve the function and development of the male reproductive system and male secondary sexual characteristics development, and female reproductive system and female secondary sexual characteristics development. So in total, we call the organs as gonads. The male gonad is the testis, while the female gonad are the ovaries. So the hormone produced by the testis is your androgen or testosterone, and the female hormone produced by the ovaries are your estrogen and progesterone. So let's take a look at the action of androgens. What's the chemical class of the hormone? It is a steroid because it looks like cholesterol. What's the function of testosterone? It supports sperm formation as well as the development of secondary male sex characteristics. So what are these? The presence of a mustache, the deepening of the voice, an enlargement of the muscle and bone. These processes are regulated by follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. In the female, the estrogens stimulate uterine lining growth. So the endometrium develops in the presence of estrogen, as well as the development and maintenance of female secondary sexual characteristics, such as the enlargement of the breasts and the deposition of fat in the pelvis area, smoothing of the skin, um, and fineness of the hair. Progesterone, on the other hand, also promotes growth and uterine lining development, but at the same time, it is the primary hormone that supports pregnancy. It causes an increase in blood flow into the placenta and into the fetus, as well as an enlargement of the uterus during pregnancy. That is why it is called progesterone, because it stimulates gestation or pregnancy. Progestation. And for our last slide, we have here the menstrual cycle. So what do I want you to um, take particular attention to? Estrogen causes the lining of the uterus, which is this one, to thicken. Okay? Estrogen causes the lining of the uterus to thicken, and progesterone causes the lining of the uterus to be more mature. Estrogen causes the lining of the uterus to thicken, but progesterone causes that lining to become more mature. Estrogen is produced by the follicle, which contains the egg cell. The cells of the follicle, which contains the egg cell, produces estrogen. Progesterone, on the other hand, is produced whenever the egg cell has been ovulated and the follicle matures into what we call the corpus luteum. Again, the progesterone is secreted by the corpus luteum, which is a remnant of the ovarian follicle after ovulation. Okay. Next, what do I want you to appreciate? Follicle stimulating hormone, which is secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, causes the development of the follicle here. And luteinizing hormone, again secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, causes ovulation and the development of the corpus luteum. Okay. And lastly, please remember, for you to be able to understand the menstrual cycle, that follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone rely on negative feedback. So, if you have a lot of progesterone, that will inhibit the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. However, luteinizing hormone has positive feedback with estrogen. That means estrogen will stimulate the release of luteinizing hormone. Okay, are you ready? Let's combine all of those information together to appreciate the menstrual cycle. So the menstrual cycle, again, occurs in females, and it has a relative length of 21 days up to 35 days. But the common is 28 days. But it is still normal if the cycle length is 21 days up to 35 days. Anything shorter than 21 days is abnormal, and anything longer than 35 days is abnormal. So the normal is 21 to 35. Let's begin the menstrual cycle with day 0. During day 0, the levels of estrogen, which is this yellow line, and progesterone, which is this blue line, are very low. Because estrogen and progesterone during day 0 is very low, there is no hormone that maintains the endometrium. And so the endometrium is being shed because there is low level of estrogen and progesterone. As the endometrium is being shed, or the inner lining of the uterus is being shed, that will manifest as menstrual bleeding. So, the menstrual bleeding lasts usually from day 0 to day 4, 5 days. Okay? So, because the levels of estrogen and progesterone during the menstrual bleeding phase is very low, there is no negative feedback because the levels of estrogen and progesterone are low. So there is no negative feedback to follicle stimulating hormone. So because of the low levels of estrogen and progesterone, follicle stimulating hormone is being secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. As the anterior pituitary gland secretes the follicle stimulating hormone, the follicles develop. Okay? And as the follicles develop, remember, that the cells of the follicles around the egg cell secrete estrogen. As they develop, the levels of estrogen go up. As the levels of estrogen go up, the follicle and the egg cell matures. Okay? And as it goes up, as the estrogen level goes up, what happens? The anterior pituitary gland responds to high levels of estrogen by releasing luteinizing hormone. As the luteinizing hormone is released, the egg cell ovulates. Okay? Because of the action of luteinizing hormone. So as the egg cell is ovulated, the remnant of the follicle now transforms into a very efficient gland at producing both estrogen and progesterone. This is your corpus luteum. So once the egg cell has been ovulated, the corpus luteum has been formed, progesterone now is being secreted. Progesterone is being secreted and it causes the endometrium to both thicken and become more mature. Okay? So as it becomes now more mature, the progesterone will cause negative feedback and it will decrease the levels of FSH and LH. Now, because there are little FSH and LH, the corpus luteum starts to die because there is no luteinizing hormone. As the corpus luteum dies, the levels of progesterone and follicle stimulating hormone decreases. And as it decreases further, it will now be unable to maintain the endometrium, and the endometrium sloughs off. And that cycle occurs on and on from menarche or start of menstruation up to menopause or the end of menstruation. This is our last slide, and through this lecture we are able to appreciate the hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary gland as well as the hormones that respond to the hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, namely the glands, the thyroid gland, the adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla, as well as the testes. We have also discussed the endocrine function of the pancreas, in particular insulin, which responds to high levels of glucose, and glucagon, which responds to low levels of glucose. Lastly, we have touched the menstrual cycle and how there is negative feedback between estrogen, progesterone, the anterior pituitary gland, and the follicle, as well as the uterus, which responds to these levels of estrogen and progesterone.